In this video, I'm going to cover some of the basics of using InDesign, which is the Adobe Creative Suite's software that is used to create layouts, books, and other compilations of images and text that we want to compose together. So to begin with, when you open InDesign on your computer, if you are using a Creative Cloud version of the software, it may look slightly different from what I'm using here. This is from CS6, which is their previous release, but a lot of the options should be the same in whatever version you are using. To begin with, I can open a recent document that I was working on, or I can create a new document. So to begin with, I'm going to click Create New Document, and you can see that I get this New Document dialog that pops up. For our purposes in this class, we want to make sure that we always have facing pages checked, which means that our document will behave like a book in which we are looking at two pages side by side when it's open. That will allow us to compose the two pages as a single layout. We want to probably leave these options as they are. Number of pages, this is how many pages the document will have to begin with. Start page number 1, that's how it's going to number the document. This is where you can specify your page size. It's possible to change this later, but it's a little bit difficult, so I recommend doing some thinking about this before you create your document. A letter-sized document is going to be 8.5 by 11, so this is often the safest choice. This means that every individual page is going to be 8.5 by 11, so a two-page spread, when the two facing pages are next to each other, is going to be a total of 11 by 17 if we have it in the portrait orientation, which is our next option. We can also choose a landscape orientation, which if we were doing facing pages with a letter-sized page would mean that our total layout is 22 wide by 8.5 tall. For the purposes of this tutorial though, I'm going to choose a portrait orientation and a letter-sized page. We can also specify if we want to include columns in our document. For legibility, I encourage all of my students to use columns. 3 seems to be a nice number, but you can experiment with the proportion that feels right to you. The gutter between the columns is the, I mentioned it by saying between the columns. The gutter is the spacing between the columns. 1 point is the default. I believe that if you type in a value other than pixels, which is what P stands for, such as 0.25 inches, it will convert it to pixels for you. And then here we have our margins, which is the space between the edge of the page and the edge of where we want our images to fall. Because most commercially available printers do not do full bleed, meaning printing to the absolute edge of the page. It's important to create at least a small margin. I believe that 3 pixels or 3 points, excuse me, in this is going to translate to roughly half an inch. You may have noticed I just typed in 0.5 inches to test this, and when I advance to the next box, yes, it's reverted to 3PO. So I'm going to hit OK, and this is the resulting document. So this is the InDesign workspace that we've entered. By default, you may have some tools in your workspace, or it may open more like mine, where it's relatively empty. So we want to give ourselves some tool palettes to work with. The way that we're going to access that is from the window drop-down at the top. So I'm having a little bit of difficulty with my InDesign. I'm going to pause the video for a moment and resolve this. Okay, I believe I've resolved my issue. You should be able to click on Window, and it will drop down, and these are all of the different options that are available to us. The easiest way to pull up a bunch of tool palettes is to hover over the workspace rollout, and I like to select typography. Since I've closed all of my tool space windows, if I were to select this now, nothing would happen, but I could reset typography, and then a bunch of tools are going to appear over here on the right hand side of my workspace, and another set of tools are going to appear over here on the left hand side. You probably noticed that I'm going to pause one more time because I'm having difficulty again. You probably noticed that there were a whole series of workspaces available to us, but typography is the workspace that I recommend using most frequently for portfolio design because it's going to have a big array of tools available to us that we will find useful. If you want to rearrange your workspace, these tool palettes will fly out from the side. By default, they're docked on the side, but if we grab this gray portion of it, I can click and pull it out here, and now I am free to move it anywhere I would like. If I want to dock it again on the side, I can click it and drag it, and I will get this blue line, this blue bar, indicating that it wants to stick to the side of my workspace. The same thing with this other collection of tool palettes on the right. It can fly out as its own free box if you prefer to work that way, or if you're working on 2 monitors, you can always put this on your other monitor. And then again, I can dock it on the side. I'm getting this blue bar indicating it wants to stick there. So these are a series of tool palettes which I can expand by clicking on them. Pages is the first one. This is how we're going to navigate our document. You'll notice that Pages has one section at the top, which is the master page section, and then another section at the bottom, which is the actual pages we're going to be laying out. And there are things that tend to kind of hide up here. So if we have multiple master pages that we're working with, we may want to expand this section by clicking and dragging this little bar so we can really see what's happening here. Otherwise, we're going to have to scroll up and down, and it can be a little bit difficult to understand what's happening. Layers is another important tool palette we're going to be working with. We're not going to address swatches today, but eventually we will talk about a lot of these different tool palettes. The other one we're going to talk about today is character and character styles, which are going to control our text for the document. And you can simply expand these or close them by clicking on the name. Much like the larger collection of tools, if we want, each one of these flies out on its own. You can click and drag it into your workspace, or click and drag it back in, and it will give you this blue bar indicating that it wants to stick in there. So if you want to rearrange your workspace in any way, that's also a possibility. InDesign and most of the Adobe suite is very flexible with regards to how you have your workspace organized, so you can organize it in a way that makes sense to your workflow. So these are the basics of the InDesign interface. We're going to talk a moment about document setup. If you change your mind about some of these initial settings that you've gone ahead and set up in the first new document dialog box, we can change some of these settings by going to File, Document Setup, and this is where we are going to be able to access our page size and our margins. Again, it's a little bit difficult to change this once you've been working on a document for a bit, so I recommend thinking hard about the proper size for your document before you begin it. A letter size page is always a safe choice, but you are free to choose any size that you would like, bearing in mind that we will eventually print it. We can also control the way in which our document grid is set up. So these columns appear in purple, and we have our page margins at the top and bottom appearing in a pink. We can cause these to, or we can hide these, by using a keyboard shortcut. I believe it is, oh, pardon me, I'm having a little bit of difficulty here again. I believe the keyboard shortcut is holding Control and hitting the comma. Oh no, pardon me, that is actually the grid that I've activated. So if you hold Control and hit the colon key, you can turn off your guides. You can turn them on again the same way, but these are non-printing objects, meaning that they are just there to help guide your layout. So I recommend keeping them on, as it's a nice reminder of what the grid for your document is, and adhering to a grid and a column layout is going to make your portfolio or whatever document you're laying out seem much more rigorous and allow people to focus on the content. So if we want to add more elements to our layout, we already have our columns, but we could change them by going to Layout and selecting Margins and Columns. This will allow us to increase or decrease the amount of columns in our document. You can see that it's a live edit, and as I change it, I get a preview of it. Also, under the layout options, we can choose to create guides. And if you wanted to add rows to your layout, which are also non-printing objects, this is where you would access that. You can add columns here as well, but I recommend just doing the columns through the Margins and Columns dialog box. And the reason is, if we start adding, there's a difference between the columns and the guides. That difference being that the guides are objects we can edit, and the columns are simply controlled by the document. So we're going to have these blue guides flying around in just a moment, and it's much easier to let InDesign control the columns and not worry about that. But if we want, as I mentioned, we can create rows. So you can see that as I start adding rows, they're going to appear in my document. I recommend that you select a gutter size that is equal to the gutter between your columns. That will give a uniformity to the document. So you may remember that we were using 0.25 inches as the gutter for the columns. Again, you can choose whatever you'd like. I'm going to use 0.25 to make sure that it is uniform. And I'm going to ask it to fit the guides to the margins, because if I fit it to the page, then you'll notice that the distance between the edge of the page and the beginning of my first row is equivalent to the size of the next row, and that's not really how we're going to be thinking about our layout. We're going to be thinking about the margins as the absolute limit, so we want to fit it to the margins. And when I check this, you'll notice that they shrink themselves a little bit and create an additional guide at the margins, reminding me that that's where it is beginning the division. So I'm going to hit OK. As I mentioned, these are now live objects. We can select them by clicking on them, and they turn a slightly darker shade of blue. I could delete it. I'm going to Control Z and undo that. I could select a few of them. I'm going to undo out of this as well. I can drag a window by clicking and dragging and grab multiple guides, move them around, delete them. They're very flexible. I can also create additional guides if I'm being very careful or I need them for some reason by clicking and dragging off of the ruler at the top of the page or at the side of the page. You may notice a little bit of jumpiness in the recording. I'm having some computer problems. I'm having to continually pause the video, so hopefully that's not too much of a distraction. So that is how you would create guides. The margins and columns are always going to be controlled from the Layout Margins and Columns option, and to create rows you would go to Layout Create Guides. And remember that the columns are not objects you can edit, but the guides, the blue lines, are. And if we use that same shortcut on the keyboard I mentioned earlier, it was holding Control and then hitting the colon. All of our guides will be temporarily hidden, but they are all non-printing objects regardless, so I recommend keeping them on for your own, for the benefit of your layout as a reminder. So the next thing to talk about is layers. If we come over here to the right side of our workspace and pull open our layers palette, you'll see that by default our document has one layer, which is called Layer 1. It is helpful to use layers to organize our file because they will control what sits visually on top of what else, and you can also control their visibility. This icon at the left, this little eyeball here, shows us that this layer is visible. The next empty box, if we select that or click in it, we will get a padlock icon indicating that the layer is locked and there is no way we can work on it or move things around. I'm going to keep it unlocked for now. If you had sublayers, you could expand them here. The little pen icon is telling me that I'm currently working on this layer. And then there's this little colored box here, and what that does is if we click the box, it's going to select all of the objects in our document that are on that particular layer, or if we have an object selected and this box lights up, it's going to tell us that the object is on that layer. So I recommend creating 3 layers minimum for your document, as we are going to have probably 3 types of objects at a minimum. The way you create a new layer is by coming down here to the bottom of the Layers palette and clicking this icon that looks like a piece of paper with the corner folded up. And I'm going to create another one, and now you'll see they've come in as layers 1, 2, and 3. The pen icon tells me I'm currently working on layer 3, but if I were to click on layer 1, for example, it would bring the pen back down there. Now I'm working on layer 1. I'm going to double click these one at a time to rename them something a little more logical that will help me remember it. Layer 1 I'm going to call Images, because that's the most important part of our composition for our portfolio. The images are always going to be the most important in architecture. For layer 2 I'm going to double click and I'm going to call this one Text, because we are going to have a limited amount of text in the document. And layer 3 I'm also going to rename Diagrams, because at some point we will start drawing on top of the images that we place into InDesign, because InDesign is pretty capable at diagramming things and adding some simple line work that could save you opening up Adobe Illustrator, which is another piece of software we'll be talking about this semester. But to begin with, we're going to have images and text, and the diagrams layer we will not be using today, but it's good to create it at the outset. So that addresses how layer organization works. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to place an image into our document. So I'm going to open up my Pages palette, take a look at where I am. in the document. Our master pages are going to serve as sort of templates for our document. We'll address this briefly. If I were to double click these, you could see that I jump to this other set of 2 pages side by side. They do not have the guides that we created because the guides only exist on the page in which they are created. But this master page is a template that has been applied to, you notice this little A icon on our page in our layout. This template has been applied to these pages, so the margins and columns are consistent throughout the document right now. But again, we are going to just start off by not working on a master page. We are going to worry about our one page down here and talk about laying out images. An easy way, if you're confused, you're not sure, you don't see the page highlighted, you're not sure where you are in your document, you can just double click on the page that you wish to go to. So right now I double clicked on the left master page and I'm here looking at it. Right master page, if I were to double click on that, it would jump me over to the other half of the screen. As I mentioned before though, InDesign thinks in terms of spreads, but you'll notice that I can't scroll up or down out of this area. Down here in our pages layout, if I double click to get down here, you'll notice our guides show up again. And as we start adding more pages to the document, as a matter of fact, let's add some more now, just for practice. So there's only one page to begin with because this is the cover page. But if we hold Shift and select both of these pages in the master page A spread, click and drag that down here, it's going to create a new spread, and you can see that it starts to populate. When do the same thing again, it starts to populate our document with pages that are based on that master template. So they're all going to look like our master page template A. And as I mentioned, an easy way to tell that you are in fact looking at your document and not a master page is to try scrolling. So if I were to start scrolling up through the document, you'll notice that I advance through all these pages we've created up to our cover. Now that I have reached the page, the top page of our document, let's try placing some images in here. To get a better view of what we're working on, we can use a keyboard shortcut. We can hold the Control key and hit the hyphen key, which is kind of like, it looks like a minus, and that starts to zoom us out a little bit. We can also, by that same token, hold Control and hit the plus key, and that's going to zoom us in. If you prefer to use your mouse, as I do, you can hold the Alt key and then scroll with your scroll wheel, and that's going to be a really easy way to navigate around. Another navigation trick is if you would like to scroll left to right while you are looking at the document rather than just up and down, if you hold the Control key, it will scroll you left and right. So as we're moving through the document, these keyboard shortcuts are going to be very helpful to get an accurate picture of what we're working on. Let's go ahead and place our first image. So an InDesign file is essentially a container for laying out images that exist somewhere else on your hard drive. In anticipation of laying out this document, I've gone ahead and created a folder on my hard drive for the project. I've named it something logical. For this particular project, I called it sample file, and within that folder, this is going to be our project folder where we save our project. As a matter of fact, because we've done a little bit of work, let's go ahead and save it right now. So here I am in the sample file folder. I'm going to call this document sample file. Excuse me, I just realized I'm out of frame. So this is what the save dialog box should look like when it pops up. I am in the sample file folder. You'll see that I've created my links folder here, and I'm going to just title it sample file and save it as an InDesign document. I'm going to hit save. So now we have sample file.indd. If you have multiple documents open at once, they will appear here as a series of tabs, but I just have this one open right now. So now we are ready to place some images into our document. As I mentioned, InDesign is a piece of software for layout. Anytime you hear people talking about layout, you should think InDesign and not another piece of Adobe software. And each InDesign document is essentially a container for images that live elsewhere on your hard drive. So to place my first image, I'm going to go to File and select Place. If you like keyboard shortcuts, as I do, you could also hold Control and hit D. And this is going to open up a folder on your hard drive, and I'm going to suggest that when you are laying out a document, you save everything in the same location as that folder for the project you are working on. So I'm going to navigate to my sample file folder. I recommend you create a folder called links, because that is the word that InDesign uses to call these images that are being referenced from elsewhere on your hard drive. And I recommend that you start saving your images into the links folder. If you are placing images from elsewhere on your hard drive, there is an easy way to gather them all together later in the process. But InDesign is essentially going to do this for you, where it's going to create a links folder and drop them all in there. So I'm going to open my links folder. I only have one image for this project, but that's alright because it's just a sample. I'm going to select my image and click open. And you should see that your image is now stuck to your cursor, essentially. The easiest way to get the image into the document is to simply click, and it's going to come in at essentially full size. So this image is now in my document at the full size that it was saved. But that is obviously a little bit too large. It's going right off the page, so I'm going to delete that and try it again. This time I'm going to use my keyboard shortcut. I'm going to hold Control and hit D to place an image. And I'm going to select the Farnsworth House image here, click Open, and this time rather than just clicking, I'm going to click and drag, and I'm going to take advantage of my grid lines because InDesign wants to snap to those. So I'm going to start here in the upper left-hand corner, click and drag, and I'm going to make this image the size of the full page, and you'll notice that it kind of wants to snap to those guides, and when I release the mouse button, it has placed our image on the page. A good thing to be aware of is the layer that you are currently working on. I didn't check that before I placed my image, but I should have. You'll see that I am on the images layer here. An easy way to tell that is to, as I mentioned, if you check this box or click this box over here, it's going to highlight everything in the document that's on that particular layer. We can also, by that same token, select an image or an object in our document, and that box should highlight itself, telling us that it is on that layer. So now we're going to talk about doing some basic transformations to your images. One more note on layers first, excuse me. So if we wanted to change the layer that this image is on, again, this box over here, we would select the image, and then with this box we would click and drag to another layer. Say hypothetically we wanted to put it on that layer, and you'll notice that the frame around it has changed colors, indicating that it's moved to another layer. For the time being though, I want to keep this on the images layer, which makes the most sense for our document. So the two most important tools for working with images in InDesign are the selection tool, which is the filled in arrow, and the direct selection tool, which is the empty or the white arrow. The selection tool is going to allow us to control the image frame. InDesign thinks of frames and their content as being somewhat independent of each other. So if we are using our selection tool, we can move the frame around and the content is going to come with it. However, if we choose our direct selection tool, when I hover over the image, I'm going to get this hand, and we're affecting the content now, but I am not affecting the frame itself. So I am able to move around the image that's inside of the frame, but not the frame itself. Pardon me, I'm having a moment of difficulty with my computer. Here we are. So an easy way to correct some adjustments that you may have made to your image is generally, I recommend thinking of the frame as the most important aspect of the layout. As long as your frame is placed where you would like it to be and it's sized properly, you're going to have an easier time laying out your document. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit, and I want to snap this to my guides here because it's important to always use your guides, make them really count, make them work for you. And I want this image to sort of snap to the frame. So an easy way to get it to fit in there is to right click and navigate down to fitting and tell it to fill the frame proportionally, and that's going to do what you might expect, where the content is going to fill up the frame, but it's not going to distort itself. It's going to maintain its proportions, which is what we always want to do. We want to do things proportionally with InDesign. When I click that, you'll see that the image has then filled the frame. You also probably noticed that I made the frame slightly smaller. There is a little bit of image outside of it now. We could continue to crop it in that same fashion as long as we are using our selection tool. For now though, I think this is acceptable. It may happen occasionally that even though, as I'm recommending, I think that the frame is the tool you should use for your layout, it may happen that you have sized your content and not the frame. Again, I don't recommend this because it doesn't snap quite as easily, but just for argument's sake, it may happen that you have a frame such as mine, which is the size of this whole 6 square area, and our content has been downsized to just this. I was jumping back and forth between my selection and direct selection tools just now, by the way. And the way that you can address this is to again use the fitting tools. I'm going to right click and navigate down to fitting, and we can ask it to fit the frame to the content. So again, you'll notice that the frame has snapped itself down here to the content. A fast way to change the size of the frame and the content together is to use your selection tool, and if I hover over these little handles in the corners of my image, let's say I wanted to bring it back to the size it was before, you'll notice that I get these little arrow icons telling me I can apply different transformations to it to stretch it. If I hold Control and Shift and hover over the corner, Control and Shift on my keyboard, when I start to resize this, whoops, InDesign flipped. Again, I apologize for all of the jumping and pausing. So if I hold Control and Shift and begin to resize this, when I let go of it, you'll notice it is resized not just the frame, but the content along with it. And that's what holding Control while you resize something does. Holding Shift while you resize something will control the proportion of it. So if I'm not holding Control and I do that same action, it's going to crop our image, and then we'll have to fit it again. So those are that's using two keyboard shortcuts in conjunction with each other. Okay, so I'm going to undo that and crop this image ever so slightly. So as I've mentioned a few times already, InDesign does not contain the images, rather it is referencing them from somewhere else on your hard drive and laying them out for us. But fundamentally, we need to make sure that those image files are coming with us wherever we are working on our project. So if we were at school, we would have to have them temporarily on the hard drive or on the school's network. I recommend probably keeping them on your USB drive and working from that, but also always backing up to the cloud, either Dropbox, Google Drive, Box, or some other cloud-based file sharing service like this. But to check the links, which is the word that InDesign uses to describe the images that are contained, we have to access another tool which is not in this palette. So I'm going to navigate to the top to the window drop-down and activate links. So now I get this dialog box that is showing me all of the links that are present in my entire document. The Farnsworth House is the only link in this particular document. If I click the image and select it, it's going to highlight in the links palette, letting me know that that's what I'm looking at. And it's got this information down here that tells me where on the hard drive it is. Down here at the bottom, it's telling me the path to that file. So this is important because it may happen that you edit an image or you possibly even move it. So let's say, for argument's sake, I'm working in my links folder and I decide that I've got too many images and I need to organize them a little bit. So I may make a subfolder called Images 1 and Images 2. So I'm organizing my links folder so I can find things easier. But the problem is, when I move this from the links folder to the subfolder images, or if you move it anywhere else on your hard drive, when we return to our InDesign document, you're going to notice that we have this question mark icon, which is telling us that InDesign doesn't know where to look for it. So there are two ways that we could fix this. One is that we could right-click on the link in the links palette and navigate to relink, or we could simply click on the question mark on the image, and it is going to give us the opportunity to show InDesign where we have saved that image. And I believe that I have saved it. I'm going to navigate here, still having a little bit of difficulty. I'm going to find that image, show InDesign where we have actually saved it, and you'll notice that the question mark disappears. The reason this is important is that if we didn't relink our images, even though it appeared to be in the document, when we went to finally export to a PDF, it would just print as a preview. So it would be extremely pixelated and blurry and illegible to anyone. It wouldn't even look as good as it does here on the screen, because really, when it's missing a link, it's just sort of a memory. Like it's InDesign's best guess as to what that image looked like, but it's no longer finding it. By that same token, if we have been working on one of our images and performing some manipulations to it, we will have to update our links. So I don't expect you to do this part to follow along. I'm simply doing it to illustrate. But if we had done some work to that image, I'm going to open it up with Photoshop and just do a quick manipulation to it. Oop. So let's say I've decided to invert the colors of this image and then save it again with the same file name. When I come back to InDesign, we're going to have this icon telling us that the link needs to be updated. That's the caution sign. And again, we could right-click it in the Links palette and go to Update Link. We could also click this drop-down in the Links palette and tell it to update all of the links in our document. Or again, we could just click on the icon in the upper left-hand corner of the image. And I don't find this to be a particularly appealing image, so I'm going to change it back and then update our link again. But this is a technique that you are going to find very useful, because the workflow that I'm going to suggest all the students follow this semester is that you keep a live Photoshop file of all of your documents, and then when you are done working on them, you save them to a .jpeg or a .tiff or a .pdf image file, and then you can continue to overwrite the same flattened image file and just update your links in your InDesign file. That way you can have one layout that you work with continuously, and you simply update your links as you've done more work to them. So I already briefly introduced the idea of master pages, but I just want to talk a little bit more about them to make it perfectly clear. So I'm going to delete this image, and I'm going to delete these guides from my page. I should also mention that you cannot select images and guides at the same time. If you try to select them both at the same time, InDesign is going to think that you only want to select the images. So, as I mentioned, master pages can be thought of as a template that you lay things out using. So, we are going to apply a master page to the pages in our actual document, but then the master page is going to be sort of a generic container that's really just information about the way we want to organize our layout, but it's not going to contain the actual content. So the way that I'm going to illustrate this is I'm going to have one master page spread that's just columns, and another master page spread that's columns and rows. So the way that you would create a new master page spread is by clicking this little icon down here when you're working in the master page portion of the Pages palette. When I click this icon, it is going to generate a new master page spread. If your master page spreads are not actually spreads, if they are just single pages, you need to go back to your document setup and check to make sure that you have facing pages checked, because otherwise this is going to cause you big problems down the line. So make sure that you are always working with facing pages. So now that I've checked that option, I have two master page spreads. To begin with, they look like each other because they're both master page spreads that have three columns, excuse me. I can jump back and forth between them and they appear to be the same. So let's add rows to the B master. So I've double-clicked to access the B master page spreads. I'm going to navigate to Layout, tell it I want to create guides. I'm going to create 4 rows with a 1/4 inch gutter and click OK. And now you'll notice that those guides are not on the A master, but they are on the B master. So when we come down to our document, we created all of our pages. So this is actually the live document that we are editing. We've created all of our pages using the A master. Therefore, it follows that all of our pages would simply have columns and not rows. And that is true as we navigate through the document. But let me zoom out so I can illustrate this a little more clearly. The way that you would change the master page layout applied to pages is to select those layouts and then click and drag them. So I can click and drag these. Let's say we want to apply the B master layout to pages 2 and 3. You'll notice that we start to get the rows again. If we wanted to change the layout, again, we could click and drag A back onto it. We could also right-click these pages. I could select both of them at once, right-click, and tell it to apply a master to them if I wanted to go back to B. And furthermore, we may have occasions where we want to remove the master page layout altogether and have no template on our pages. I don't recommend doing this often, but it may happen that if you just have like a full bleed image, for example, you could apply the none to a page. So I've gone ahead and applied the none to my page 1. And apart from the margins and columns, which are part of the document itself, it is no longer affected by any master page layout. As I mentioned, that's not necessarily a desirable condition for most cases, so I'm going to reapply the A. And you'll see if you look through our pages, we have A, B, B, A, A. And much like we did before, if we wanted to create new pages, we could simply click and drag our master page layout into our page stack, and it's going to generate new pages based on that template. So that is a very brief introduction to master pages. The next item to discuss is text boxes. So when we are adding text in InDesign, we are always going to use the type tool, which is this icon over here in our toolbar that looks like the letter T. Much like with images, we simply click and drag to create a text frame, and we could start typing inside of the text frame. By default, InDesign uses Minion Pro size 12 font. I want to illustrate something cool that InDesign is capable of, so I'm going to go online really quickly. I'm going to pause the video and grab some dummy text. When you are laying out a document, it's very often helpful to have dummy text because you are eventually going to have text in your document, but sometimes you don't want to be bothered with what it actually is just yet. So a nice technique that I have learned from graphic designers is to use something called lorem ipsum text, which is essentially fake Latin. There are lots of lorem ipsum generators online. They will just generate paragraphs and paragraphs of this fake Latin text, which is intended to be as not distracting as possible, but also to look like English text. So it will give us a sense of how our text will look on the page visually. I'm just going to control copy and control paste it in there. And the idea is that the text is a visual element of the layout. We just don't want to be bothered with exactly what it is. So we had an awful lot of text, 5 paragraphs to be exact, and I pasted it into this one column. As I mentioned, InDesign thinks of frames and content as being independent of each other. So the way that InDesign is telling me that I have text running out of the frame is that it is giving me this little red warning down here. And if I take my selection tool, again, I've used the type tool to create the text frame, but I'm going to use the selection tool to actually manipulate the text frame because that's the tool that we always want to use when we're working with objects. I can take my selection tool and I can resize the column. I could make it double width, and the text is going to just continue to adjust to whatever the column has available in terms of its dimensions. But no matter how large I make this particular column, if it is just one column, the text is always going to run off of it. Therefore, I am getting this red icon down here, which is telling me there is what is called overset text. So if I click this, it's going to essentially stick my text to my cursor, and I can click and drag and create another column of text. Pardon me here. I can create another column of text. There we go. Okay, so if I click and drag, I've created another column of text, and it is going to continue to run into there. So if I were to edit my text, as you likely will while you're working on your document, and add to it, you'll notice that it starts to affect both of the columns of text, and it's going to just continue running through them. They are now connected to each other. I'm going to undo that. It may happen that you've laid out your document with text boxes already. So let's say I have a blank text box here, and I know that I want my text to continue into it. We can use that same technique. Take our selection tool, locate the overset text icon, this little red box down here, and when we get our text stuck to our cursor, I can click on the existing text box and it is going to flow into there. So now, again, whenever I adjust the size of my columns, the text is going to adjust with it to capture as much as possible, and we will know that it is running outside of the text box if we get that little icon. So now that we've got some text in here, we want to control the way that our text looks in terms of font and size. The most direct way to do so would be to access our characters tools. So if I highlight this text, I can open up the character palette and change my font. I'm going to change my font to Roboto, which is a font made by Google that I like. It's very legible. It's good for a kind of modern aesthetic, and it's very compatible with a lot of different devices. Prints very well. I'm going to change the size of my text to 10 points. You'll notice that I also have the text options up here at the top of the screen when I have my text highlighted. I think that in my workflow I tend to actually use this a little more frequently than the character styles on the side. But again, all of the options are available down here as well. So if I change the font size, you'll notice that they adjust the columns as necessary. If I zoom out a little bit, this is what I was talking about when I meant, the text is really kind of a visual element on the page, and it's going to look, it's sort of unimportant at this point what it looks like. It's just, or what it's saying. It's really just how it reads on the page that we're concerned with. So if we've created a character look that we're happy with, I think this looks pretty reasonable. We are going to open up the Character Styles tab, which is a way of managing all of the fonts and font sizes in our document, and we're going to create a character style based on this. So what that means is a character style is a set of rules about the font that text should use and the size that it should be. And the reason that we should create this is that we're going to have text on many different pages of our document, and it can be very tedious to manage them manually in terms of, every time we create a text box confirming, okay, am I using the same font size I did before? Am I using the same font I did before? Have I changed the color or the space between the letters? And using character styles is a nice way to be certain that we're being consistent. So I've opened up character styles. By default, I have none in my document, but if I hover over the new icon down here, the piece of paper, I'm going to take my type tool, select this on the left, and I'm going to highlight all of my text, and then I'm going to click on character style 1 and double click on it to open it up, and now I have defined this character style based on this text. So this particular text I'm going to call body. This is the text I'm going to use for most of the document. If I go to the next option, the basic character formats, it appears as though it has not derived all of the information, but this is where you would define the information about your character style. So again, I'm going to choose those same options. I'm going to tell it I want it to be Roboto. Whoops, I prematurely closed that, so if I come back here to my character styles and double click body to reopen it, go back to the basic character formats, it's remembered that I want it to be Roboto, and I'm going to tell it, let's say that I've changed my mind, and this is a good example of why character styles are useful, and I want to go back to 12-point font. I enter 12 here, I hit OK, and now you'll see that it is telling me that this character's, when this is highlighted, it's telling me that it is body, and the little plus icon is indicating that there is something about the text that has been, it's based on the body character style, but it's been somehow modified. So really what I want to do is to properly apply the body style, and I simply click on it, and you'll notice that its font size changed to reflect the character style, which we modified in that rollout. Once you have started populating your document with multiple pieces of text on multiple pages, you're going to be very grateful that you have set up your character styles, because you can manage just a couple of them. I recommend creating at least one for body and one for headers as well. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. Create a style name header. I'm going to put it in the same font family, and this one I'm going to make twice as big. I'm going to call it size 24. So now we have header and body, and by that same token, if I were to activate my text or my type tool and select all of the text in these columns, if I were to apply the header character style, their font size would change to reflect that, and I can go back to body. So these are essentially presets for font styles that are going to be helpful as we are laying out our document. When you are creating new text as well, let's say that these columns are a little bit shorter, And you'll notice that this is another technique I use often. I am clicking and dragging a window to select multiple things at once. I could shrink these columns down a little bit to make some room at the top. If I select a specific character style when I create new text, it is going to already be in that style. So it is setting up a lot of variables for me ahead of time. So I have my header character style selected, and I'm going to select my type tool, click and drag a window at the top, and when I start typing, it will be in the same style as the header character style. So that is a brief introduction to laying out columns of text and laying out character styles for your document. One brief final note on the text is that it behaves much like images with the fitting tools, where if we were to use our selection tool, select a piece of text, and right-click it, we still have fitting options. There's a little fewer fitting options for text, but I can fit the frame to the content, and it's going to snap it down to contain exactly what I have here. So if you've got a really large frame and not a lot of text inside of it, you may consider fitting the frame to the content as a way of cleaning up your document and its appearance. Additionally, I am now realizing that I somewhat carelessly did not create my text boxes on the correct layer, so I'm going to go ahead and select them all by clicking and dragging a window with my selection tool. I'm going to navigate to my layers palette, and I'm going to click and drag them up to the text layer. So now they are on the text layer, where I can turn them on or off independently of my images. But again, this was a page in the document. This was just an example, so I'm going to delete this. The final thing that I want to discuss in this video before we get into saving your work is the most effective way to use your master pages. So I'm going to do two sample layouts really quickly, or one sample layout, and then explain how to populate it. So I've come up here to my A master page spread, and the real idea for our first few assignments is to create these master page spreads that are going to give you different possible layouts. You may have one that's about cataloging a series of images that are all similar. You may have one about comparing options, and you may have one about finding conclusions. So as I discussed in my first lecture, the way that you'd lay these sheets out would be a little bit different, but it's going to be useful to you to have a few different types of layouts available to you in the form of master page spreads. So I'm going to lay one out that suggests I have a little bit of text on one page and a large image on the other page. So the way that I would do that is I would start populating, again, being sure that I'm working on my master page. I would start populating it with these different elements. Because images are the most important piece of our document, you should probably start with images. So you could start by going to File, Place, and placing, if you already have your images selected and gathered, your images, knowing that they will be swapped out later. But I recommend using this tool down here that is the rectangular frame tool. It is a rectangle with an X through the middle of it. And when I have that activated, I can click and drag. Whoops, and I'm going to hit Escape to cancel that because I'm not working on the correct layer. Again, I'm going to activate the images layer. You need to be always conscious of that. I'm going to start my rectangular frame tool and click and drag an image over here. I'm going to say that the idea behind this layout is that there is a large image on the left-hand side of the page, and there is a full-size image on the right-hand side of the page. And the idea with the rectangular frame tool is really that this is a placeholder. It is suggesting that there will be an image here eventually, but we don't know what it is, and again, we don't want the content itself to distract from the layout, because that's really all that we're evaluating right now. You can feel free to use a placeholder image if you prefer, but I find the rectangular frame to be easier and more straightforward. So I'm going to draw a large rectangular frame on the second page, and then I'm going to change to my text layer. If I activate the text layer, I'm going to make a column of text using the type tool. Pardon me, I'm having a little bit of computer difficulty still. Okay, so I've activated my type tool and I'm on the text layer. I'm going to make a column of text, and I'm going to paste in some of that lorem ipsum text, which is still stuck to my keyboard, I hope. Yep, and it appears as though it has come in as the header style because I have that selected here. So again, I'm going to come in, do Control A to select all of the text and change it to be body. And now with my selection tool, the filled in arrow, I'm going to create 2 more columns of text that are linked to this first one. I'm going to do so by selecting the text, clicking the overset text icon, drawing another frame, and then repeating the process. Again, where you see that text gets stuck to my cursor. And then I'm going to do a little bit of really quick cleanup where I'm going to zoom in and make sure that my columns of text are all aligned. I'm going to shrink this down just a little bit, and you'll notice that I get these green lines. InDesign likes to snap and align things, so we should take advantage of that where possible. Okay, so this is not a particularly attractive layout, but it's an acceptable one, and we will say that this is our master page layout. So you'll notice that in our document, every page of the document, if we jump down to the document itself, has that master page reflected on it. So here, pages 2 and 3, where we have master page 2 applied, where it's simply the rows and the columns, that's all that we see here. But if we scroll down to pages 4 and 5, if we scroll down to pages 4 and 5, you'll notice that they now reflect the layout of master page A. So this is the way that I suggest you set up your portfolio. Actually, it's a bit more than a suggestion. It is a requirement that you have to make master pages and lay them out with a template or as a template. So I've created a template for one of these possible layouts, and now when I'm ready to begin actually populating this page with my specific images and text, the final thing that we need to be aware of is that by default these elements are locked because they're still sort of on the master page, and we need to make them what's called live or editable. And the way that you do that is you hold Control and Shift on your keyboard and click on the elements one by one. And what that's going to do is it's going to sort of wake them up. You'll see that it's activated itself now. It is selectable. I've activated this one now as well, and now I'm also going to activate my text boxes. I'm holding Control Shift and just clicking on them to wake them up and make them live. So now they are no longer part of that master spread, they are part of this page, and they can be edited independently of the master page spread, which is what we want. So hopefully your document will not contain simply lorem ipsum text, but actually your explanation for your projects once you've had a chance to compose it. So you will come in and revise whatever the lorem ipsum text or placeholder text is that you've chosen, and you will use the selection tool to select these image frames and navigate to File, Place, and then populate your document with the images that you have set up. So I'm going to do the same thing for this one. Choose the Farnsworth house, and I'm going to apply a fitting operation to each of these. For this one, I'm going to fit the content, or fill the frame proportionally, And for this one, I am simply going to use my direct selection tool and make it much larger. So again, not a particularly attractive layout, not a particularly attractive subject matter, although this is a beautiful house and a significant project. But this is an example of the different techniques that we are asking you to use as you compose your portfolio and your catalogs for your project. So the final thing to do, now that we've done all this work to our project, is to save it. And I'm going to navigate to File and simply select Save, since I've already saved the project once. And the next equally important thing to do is to make sure that we are grabbing all of our links and fonts that we are using in our document so that it will open and look correct even on another computer where we don't necessarily have the exact same folder structure with all of our links. So next we are going to navigate to File and select Package. And this is going to bring up a summary of the package. I'm going to just advance through this and select the package option. That brings me to this next dialog box, which we can advance through as well. And now I am in a folder, I'm in a subfolder, so I'm going to navigate back up to a directory where I can find it. So here we are in the sample file. Yeah, I might as well save it in here. By default, it wants to call it sample file folder. So I suggest that when you package your document, you date it. So today's date is September 8th, 2018. I'm going to go ahead and punch in that date, and I'm going to call it sample file folder. And what this will allow us to do is, if we have multiple packages, we can easily at a glance identify what the most current one is, because you're going to be continuing to work on these documents throughout the semester. I'm going to hit package. It thinks for a moment about saving everything, and now when I go to that folder where we've saved it, it's created a folder called 2018-09-08, that's September 8th, 2018, sample file folder. And when I open this up, what it's done is it's run around my computer and it's located all of the images that are in that document, saved them into a folder called links for me. It's also run around the document and made sure that it knows all of the fonts that are used, and it's saved those into a folder for me so that they will all display correctly. And it's also created another copy of the file. So when we are ready to leave and go wherever we need to go, if we're done working, we want to make sure that we have this folder containing the InDesign file, the .indd file, the links folder, and also the document fonts. So before you leave school, whenever you've been doing work on your InDesign files, make sure to package them, and then the folder is what you want to take with you. The folder, not just the InDesign file, but the folder. I'm saying it multiple times because it is very important, and invariably somebody will forget it. So we've done all this work on our document, we've PDF'd it, and we are ready to leave. But let's say we want to export this to a file format other than InDesign. The way that we would do that when we are finished with our document, or if we want to proof it, is to navigate to File and select Export. And again, it's going to ask us to select a location for it. Because this is just an example, I'm not going to think too hard. I'm going to export it to the same folder. And when I hit save, it's going to bring me to this interactive PDF dialog. One of the important options to be aware of is whether you are exporting pages or spreads. If you export pages, it will export each individual page as its own page of the PDF. If you export spreads, it will export each pair of facing pages as its own page of the PDF. So if we are proofing this on screen, spreads is a better option, because that way it will look more like a book when we open it up in Adobe PDF Reader. But if we are exporting this for a print book, we would want to export it as pages. So always be cognizant of the format that you are exporting to. So I'm going to go ahead and ensure that my resolution is set to 300 ppi. This is also referred by some other piece of software as DPI, but it's dots per inch or pixels per inch, and 300 is what we want as our high resolution default. I've selected spreads because I'm going to be proofing it on the screen, and I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And after a moment of thinking to generate the PDF, because we have selected to preview our PDF on export, it will open Adobe PDF Reader, which is a little slow at the moment, but it is minimizing itself into my frame. Here we are. And now if I advance through this, you'll see that it has exported every spread as it would actually appear as a book. So the line between the two pages has disappeared, but this is a nice way to get a sense of how your layouts really work without all of the guides. So that concludes the InDesign software primer. Now you know how to set up your document, how to work with grids and margins, how to organize your layers, you know how to place images and create text boxes. You also hopefully understand the principle of links and the fact that InDesign does not contain the images, it is only organizing them. You should understand how to work with master pages, how to create new pages based on master pages and apply master pages to existing pages. And you should also understand how to save and package your PDF, or save and package your InDesign file and then export as a PDF. So thank you for watching this first software primer, and please continue on to the Photoshop primer if you have not already done so.